Welcome to Elements of Language, Literary Techniques with your professor, Dr. Lydia CdeBaca. The purpose of this lesson is to introduce some fundamental elements of language for identification and analysis during the close reading process. In this lesson, you will learn the definitions of several fundamental elements of language, learn how each element functions as a literary technique, and learn how to analyze each element in works of short fiction. I've pretty much split the literary devices into two groups in order to further distinguish them by function. So the first one, all of these elements are all related to language, and they all sort of work to develop the tone. Tone, diction, syntax, and irony all work together to contribute to the overall feeling of a piece. The second grouping focuses more on figurative language and linguistic elements of language such as symbols, metaphors, and imagery. Ironic was a word used to describe tone, but irony itself, particularly on the level of language, is sometimes difficult to hear or recognize in literature. Nevertheless, finding ironies in a work of literature is an important means of beginning to resolve a work's contradictions or tensions. Irony essentially refers to opposites or a form of innocent lying or masking. In A Glossary of Literary Terms, M.H. Abrams explains that, quote, in Greek comedy, the character called the Iron was a dissembler. A dissembler is a person who kind of lies or just puts on a performance, kind of puts on a mask, who characteristically spoke in understatement and deliberately pretended to be less intelligent than he was, yet triumphed over the alazan, or the self-deceiving and stupid braggart. In most of the modern critical uses of the term irony, there remains the root sense of dissembling or of hiding what is actually the case. Not, however, in order to deceive, but to achieve special rhetorical or artistic effects. But there are different levels of irony in literature. Verbal irony is likely the most recognizable form, as we know it as sarcasm, when one says the opposite of what is meant. Dramatic irony is when the opposite of what is expected or intended by the characters is what happens or unfolds in a work. Tragic irony is an important example of this, when a hero sets out on a certain quest in order to avoid some tragic fate, but then ends up simply confirming his destiny anyway. Finally, structural irony is a form of irony that we'll pay a lot of attention to, especially once you get into narrative analysis. This is where an author uses some element of structure, some literary device, that ends up setting up double meanings that contradict each other or are in tension with each other, or represent an ambiguity in the work's meaning. Satire can be a form of structural irony, as in satire, often a narrator seems to be approving of events that the work itself is actually critiquing. Now, we're looking at elements of language known as literary figures or figurative language. You can use the Literary Devices website again here to look up many of these terms and to see examples of how they might be used. Imagery, like tone, is a broad term that describes how a number of other literary techniques, such as metaphor, symbolism, simile, etc., work together to create a sensory experience of a work. Although the word image relates specifically to the visual sense, it is important to remember that imagery refers not just to the visual picture an author paints through figurative language, but also to the depiction of sound, touch, taste, smell, and movement. So let's talk first about symbols and symbolism. A symbol is an object, action, event, or even a word or phrase that refers to, stands in for, or signifies an idea or meaning beyond the literal meaning of the object, action, etc. Symbolism is the use of symbols to signify ideas and qualities by giving them meanings beyond their original literal meanings. Note that the key to analyzing symbols is to recognize that the context in which the author includes them may be different from a reader's understanding of the symbol. So it is important to place the symbol in the context of the work as a whole, and maybe even to think about how it's similar to or different from what you normally associate the symbol with. For example, in the US, red often symbolizes danger or a warning, and white often symbolizes purity. But in Leslie Marmon Silko's Storyteller, she reverses those meanings to fit her specific context and her work's setting and meaning. So red is a color that is used to symbolize survival, whereas white symbolizes death and danger. Like metaphors, similes are probably one of the most widely recognized literary figures, probably even more so than metaphors because they are the easiest to identify since they use a comparison term such as like or as. The challenge is, once you have identified a simile, to take the next step and explain why it is significant, what it means, and how it works. Very often, similes are used to develop imagery, such as in this last line from Sandra Cisneros' Salvador Late or Early. By comparing Salvador's disappearance at the end of the short story to, quote, a memory of kites, Cisneros develops a sense and a certain meaning. But what is that meaning exactly? What does it mean to compare someone's disappearance over the horizon to a memory of kites? As with analyzing metaphors, we have to think about the associations of the simile term. What are the meanings or associations of the memory? What might kites symbolize? Does it change that it's a memory of kites? And finally, what does that tell us or show us about Salvador and his disappearance from our view? If you have any questions, please write them down and bring them to class or post them in the student lounge. Thank you.